So today we are reading the second short story by Frank Stockton called The Discourager of the Hesitancy. This one comes after The Lady or the Tiger, which you probably didn't like the ending of. Most people do not, simply because it ends with a question. So this is the continuation of The Lady or the Tiger. So here we go. It was nearly a year after the occurrence of that event in the arena of the semi-barbaric king known as the incident of the Lady or the Tiger, that there came to the palace of this monarch a deputation of 5 strangers from a far country. A deputation would be a mission, so these 5 guys were on a mission to find something out. These men of venerable and dignified aspect and demeanor were received by a high officer of the court, and to him they made known their errand. "Most noble officer," said the speaker of the deputation, "it so happened that one of our countrymen was present here in your capital city on that momentous occasion when a young man who had dared to aspire to the hand of your king's daughter had been placed in the arena, in the midst of the assembled multitude, and ordered to open one of 2 doors, not knowing whether a ferocious tiger would spring out upon him, or a beauteous lady would advance, ready to become his bride. Our fellow citizen who was then present was a man of supersensitive feelings, and at the moment when the youth was about to open the door, he was so fearful lest he should behold a horrible spectacle that his nerves failed him, and he fled precipitately from the arena, and mounting his camel, rode homeward as fast as he could go." The poor guy was scared out of his mind. He didn't know what he was going to see. He didn't want to see a bloodbath, and he was scared to death, so he ran off before the end of the trial. We were all very much interested in the story which our countryman told us, and we were extremely sorry that he did not wait to see the end of the affair. We hoped, however, that in a few weeks' time some traveler from your city would come among us and bring us further news, but up to that day when we left our country, no such traveler had arrived. At last it was determined that the only thing to be done was to send a deputation to this country and to ask the question which came out of the open door, the lady or the tiger? The same thing you guys want to know, right? When the high officer had heard the mission of this most respectable deputation, he led the 5 strangers into an inner room where they were seated upon soft cushions and where he ordered coffee, pipes, sherbet, and other semi-barbaric refreshments to be served to them. Then, taking his seat before them, he thus addressed the visitors. "Most noble strangers, before answering the question you have come so far to ask, I will relate to you an incident which occurred not long after that to which you have referred. It is well known in all regions hereabout that our great king is very fond of the presence of beautiful women about his court. All the ladies in waiting upon the queen and royal family are most lovely maidens, brought here from every part of the kingdom. The fame of this concourse of beauty, unequaled in any other royal court, has spread far and wide. And had it not been for the equally widespread fame of the systems of impetuous justice adopted by our king, many foreigners would doubtless have visited our court." So what he basically is saying, hey, we got a lot of beautiful women here, and we would have had a lot of visitors here, but you know what? Our king's arena thing has become pretty famous too. And so we don't have as many visitors as we would have had it not been for the system of justice he's developed. But not very long ago, there arrived here from a distant land a prince of distinguished appearance and undoubted rank. To such a one, of course, a royal audience was granted, and our king met him very graciously and begged him to make known the object of his visit. Thereupon the prince informed his royal highness that, having heard of the superior beauty of the ladies of his court, he had come to ask permission to make one of them his wife. When our king heard this bold announcement, his face reddened, he turned uneasily on his throne, and we were all in dread lest some quick words of furious condemnation should leap out his quivering lips. But by a mighty effort, he controlled himself, and after a moment's silence, he turned to the prince and said, "Your request has been granted. Tomorrow at noon you shall wed one of the fairest damsels of our court." Then turning to his officers, he said, "Give orders that everything be prepared for a wedding in the palace at high noon tomorrow. Convey this royal prince to suitable apartments. Send to him tailors, bootmakers, hatters, jewelers, armorers, men of every craft whose services he may need. Whatever he asks, provide, and let all be ready for the ceremony tomorrow." But your majesty," exclaimed the prince, "before we make these preparations, I would like—" "Say no more," roared the king. "My royal orders have been given, and nothing more is needed to be said. You asked a boon, I granted it, and I will hear no more on the subject. Farewell, my prince, until tomorrow noon." At this, the king arose and left the audience chamber, while the prince was hurried away to the apartments selected for him. Here came to him tailors, hatters, jewelers, and everyone who was needed to fit him out in grand attire for the wedding. But the mind of the prince was much troubled and perplexed. I do not understand," he said to his attendants, "the precipitancy of action. When am I to see the ladies, that I may choose among them? I wish opportunity not only to gaze upon their forms and faces, but to become acquainted with their relative intellectual development. Now, think about this. Would you guys want to marry somebody that you'd never met? Somebody that you'd never talked to? Somebody that you'd never seen? Of course not. "We can tell you nothing," was the answer. "What our king thinks right, that will he do. More than this, we know not." "His Majesty's notions seem to be very peculiar," said the prince, "and so far as I can see, they do not at all agree with mine." At that moment, an attendant whom the prince had not noticed came and stood beside him. This was a broad-shouldered man of cheery aspect, who carried, its hilt in his right hand and its broad back resting on his broad arm, an enormous scimitar, the upturned edge of which was keen and bright as any razor. Now, a scimitar is a very large sword. So he's cradling this thing like a baby. It's huge. It's a huge sword. Holding this formidable weapon as tenderly as though it had been a sleeping infant, this man drew closer to the prince and bowed. "Who are you?" exclaimed his highness, staring back at the sight of the frightful weapon. "I," said the other with a courteous smile, "am the Discourager of the Hesitancy. When the king makes known his wishes to anyone, a subject or a visitor, whose disposition in some little points may be supposed not wholly to coincide with that of his Majesty, I am appointed to attend him closely, that, should he think of pausing in the path of obedience to the royal will, he may look at me and proceed." So basically, the Discourager of the Hesitancy is exactly what his name says. He is to discourage them from hesitating. He is there to remind them, one, that the king doesn't like anybody to disagree with him, and two, he doesn't like to be kept waiting. He is there to discourage them from hesitating, exactly what his name says. The prince looked at him and proceeded to be measured for a coat. The tailors and shoemakers and hatters worked all night. The next morning, when everything was ready and the hour of noon was drawing nigh, the prince again anxiously inquired of his attendants when he might expect to be introduced to the ladies. "The king will attend to that," they said. "We know nothing of the matter." "Your Highness," said the Discourager of the Hesitancy, approaching with a courtly bow, "will observe the excellent quality of this edge." And drawing a hair from his head, he dropped it upon the upturned edge of his scimitar, upon which it was cut in two at the moment of touching. So he said, "Hey, I just wanted you to check this blade out on this giant sword that I have in my hand. You know, me, the guy that's supposed to discourage you from hesitating, from doing what the king says." And he takes a hair out of his head and drops it on the blade, and it's immediately cut in two. "It's a sharp blade," says the guy with the big blade that works for the king. You catch my drift? The prince glanced and turned upon his heel. Now came officers to conduct him to the grand hall of the palace, in which the ceremony was to be performed. Here the prince found the king seated upon his throne, with his nobles, his courtiers, and his officers standing about him in a magnificent array. The prince was led to a position in front of the king, to whom he made obeisance, and then said, "Your Majesty," but before I proceed further, at this moment an attendant, who had approached with a long scarf of delicate silk, wound it around the lower part of the prince's face so quickly and adroitly that he was obliged to cease speaking. Then, with wonderful dexterity, the rest of the scarf was wound around the prince's head so that he was completely blindfolded. Thereupon the attendant quickly made openings in the scarf over the mouth and ears so that the prince might breathe and hear, and fastening the ends of the scarf securely, he retired. So as he's asking the king a question, this person comes up behind him and ties this scarf around his head, so basically he'll shut up and listen. So he is where he can't talk, he can't see, but he can breathe and listen. So that's what the king had in mind. The first impulse of the prince was to snatch the silken folds from his head and face. But as he raised his hands to do so, he heard beside him the voice of the Discourager of the Hesitancy, who gently whispered, "I am here, your highness." And with a shudder, the arms of the prince fell down by his side. Now before him he heard the voice of a priest, who had begun the marriage service in use in that semi-barbaric country. At his side, he could hear a delicate rustle, which seemed to proceed from fabrics of soft silk. Gently putting forth his hand, he felt folds of such silk close behind him. Then came the voice of the priest requesting him to take the hand of the lady by his side, and reaching forth his right hand, the prince received within it another hand, so small, so soft, so delicately fashioned, and so delightful to the touch that a thrill went through his being. Then, as was the custom of the country, the priest first asked the lady would she have this man to be her husband, to which the answer gently came, in the sweetest voice he had ever heard, "I will." Then ran raptures rampant through the prince's blood. The touch, the tone, enchanted him. All the ladies of that court were beautiful. The Discourager was behind him, and through his parted scarf he boldly answered, "Yes, I will." Whereupon the priest pronounced them man and wife. Now the prince heard a little bustle about him. The long scarf was rapidly unrolled from his head, and he turned with a start to gaze upon his bride. To his utter amazement, there was no one there. He stood alone. Unable on the instant to ask a question or say a word, he gazed blankly about him. Then the king arose from his throne and came down and took him by the hand. "Where is my wife?" gasped the prince. "She is here," said the king, leading him to a curtained doorway at the side of the hall. The curtains were drawn aside, and the prince, entering, found himself in a long apartment, near the opposite wall of which stood a line of 40 ladies, all dressed in rich attire, and each one apparently more beautiful than the rest. Waving his hand toward the line, the king said to the prince, "There is your bride. Approach and lead her forth. But remember this, that if you attempt to take away one of the unmarried damsels of our court, your execution will be instantaneous. Now delay no longer, step up and take your bride." So he takes him into a room. There's 40 women standing here, and he says, "Okay, here's your bride. Go and get her. But remember, if you take the wrong one, we're going to kill you." Remember, he hasn't seen her. He's held her hand. He's heard her. But he hasn't seen her. And he says, "Okay, go get your bride. If you take the wrong one, we're going to kill you." The prince, as in a dream, walked slowly along the line of ladies and then walked slowly back again. Nothing he could see about any one of them to indicate that she was any more of a bride than the others. Their dresses were all similar. They all blushed. They all looked up and then down. They all had charming little hands. Not one spoke a word. Not one lifted a finger to make a sign. It was evident that orders had been given them had been very strict. "Why this delay?" roared the king. "If I had been married this day to one so fair as the lady who wedded you, I should not wait 1 second to claim her." The bewildered prince walked again up and down the line. And this time, there was a slight change in the countenances of 2 of the ladies. One of the fairest gently smiled as he passed. Another, just as beautiful, slightly frowned. "Now," said the prince to himself, "I am sure it is one of these 2 ladies whom I have married. But which?" One smiled, And would not any woman smile when she saw in such a case her husband coming toward her? Then again, on the other hand, would not any woman frown when she saw her husband coming toward her and fail to claim her? Would she not knit her lovely brows? Would she not inwardly say, "It is I. Don't you know it? Don't you feel it? Come." But if this woman had not been married, would she not frown when she saw the man looking at her? Would she not say inwardly, "Don't stop at me. It is the next but one. It is two ladies above. Go on." Then again, the one who married me did not see my face. Would she not now smile if she thought me comely? But if I wedded the one who frowned, she could restrain her disapprobation if she did not like me. Smiles invite the approach of true love. A frown is a reproach to tardy advance. A smile, he keeps going back and forth. He's like, what could a smile mean? What could a frown mean? If she's smiling at me, that might mean that she sees me as her husband and tells me to come to her. But what if she's frowning because I am the one that married her and I don't recognize her? What if she is frowning at me because she's not the one I married and she sees me coming towards her and she doesn't want me to make an advance? What if she is smiling at me because she's not the one that I picked, but she would like me to be the one to pick her? What if she frowns at me because she does not like how I look? What if she smiles at me because she likes the way I look, but she's not the one I've married? What if the smile is the one about true love? What if a frown is because I'm too slow? And he keeps going back and forth in his mind, and the king is tired of it. "Now hear me," loudly cried the king. "In 10 seconds, if you do not take the lady we have given you, she who has just been made your bride shall be made your widow." And as the last word was uttered, the discourager of the hesitancy stepped close behind the prince and whispered, "I am here." Now the prince could not hesitate an instant. He stepped forward and took one of the two ladies by the hand. Loud rang the bells, loud cheered the people, and the king came forward to congratulate the prince. He had taken his lawful bride. He picked right. He picked the right woman. "Now then," said the officer to the deputation of 5 strangers from a far country, "when you can decide among yourselves which lady the prince chose, the one who smiled or the one who frowned, then I will tell you which came out of the open door, the lady or the tiger." At the latest accounts, the 5 strangers had not yet decided.